Hey everybody, this video is called Construction Underway, and tonight we're continuing our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Kings, where we're going to be looking at the construction of the temple. And as we left off with the last chapter, yesterday we looked at the preparation for the building of the temple, and today we're looking at the actual construction. So chapter 6, verse 1 through 6, it says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Jiv, which is the 2nd month, that began to build the house of the Lord. Now the house which Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. The vestibule in front of the sanctuary of the house was 20 cubits long across the width of the house, and the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house. And he made for the house windows of beveled frames. Against the wall of the temple he built chambers all around, against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and in the inner sanctuary. Thus he made side chambers all around it. The lowest chamber was 5 cubits wide, the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For he made narrow ledges around the outside of the temple, so that the support beams would not be fastened into the walls of the temple." So, as we see in the opening verses here, you can also find this recorded later in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 15 through 22. But we see that Solomon began building the temple by laying its foundation some 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt. And the literal correlation with Zephthah's statement recorded back in Judges 11:26. And the Exodus was dated back in 1445 BC. And normally the cubit was approximately 18 inches, and this would make the structure of the temple 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. However, when you look at the account given by 2 Chronicles 3:3, it may indicate that the longer royal cubit of approximately 21 inches was used in this construction of the temple. And on that measurement, that means the structure for the temple would have been 105 feet long, 35 feet wide, and 52.5 feet high. And this is the fun part when you go through the Old Testament and you start seeing measurements and everything. It can make you feel like being back in math class here. But the dimensions of the temple seem to double those of the tabernacle that we looked at back in the book of Exodus 26, verse 15 through 30, and Exodus 36, verse 20 through 34. And we see the vestibule described, which was a porch that was approximately 15 feet long in front of the temple building. And the proper windows were placed high on the inner side of the temple wall, and these openings had lattices of shutters that were capable of being open or shut or partially opened. And chambers was another attached structure that surrounded the main building, excluding the vestibule. And it provided rooms off the main hallway to house temple personnel, and to also store the equipment and treasure. So you can kind of think of it almost like a attic space in our current living, traditions. But this attached structure to the temple was 3 stories high. It was very high up, and each upper story was 1 cubit wider than the one below it. And instead of being inserted into the temple walls, beams supporting the stories rested on recessed ledges in the temple walls themselves. And later in 1 Chronicles 28, verse 11 and 12, it says that David organized and planned even before Solomon became the king. So while Solomon might be the one preparing and building the temple, this was all in the plans with his father. And the writer of Kings didn't specify where the temple was built, but 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1 gives account that it was built on Mount Moriah. And it's the very same place when you study through the book of Exodus where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. In verse 7 through 10 it says, "And the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at a quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. The doorway for the middle story was on the right side of the temple. They went upstairs to the middle story, and from the middle into the third. So he built the temple and finished it, and he paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar, and he built side chambers against the entire temple, each 5 cubits high, that were attached to the temple with cedar beams." So the erection of the temple went much faster by utilizing pre-cut and pre-fitted materials moved on rollers to the temple site. And in addition, the relative quiet would be consistent with the sacredness of the undertaking. And the entrance to the side rooms was on the south side, that was probably somewhere in the middle. And access to the second and third stories was by means of a spiral staircase that led through the middle story to the third floor. And these are some of the finest building materials used that were available. And it was a magnificent building. As you look at these details, maybe you kind of just skim through this part of the Bible and you get bored of it, but draw it out. I mean, I know I'm not an artist, but go look at pictures of what other people have pictured the description for the temple. It was a very magnificent building, and the side chambers were built in 3 stories as well. In verse 11 through 13 says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, Concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel." So during the construction of the temple, we see that God takes the time to speak to Solomon. And this is likely occurring through a prophet, or it could be a direct speaking to. And it reiterated that the fulfillment of his word to David through his son was contingent based on Solomon's obedience to the commands. And the use of the same words, "I will dwell among the children of Israel," in verse 13, as in Exodus 29, verse 45, it implied that Solomon's temple was the legitimate successor to the tabernacle. And the Lord forewarned Solomon and Israel that the temple was no guarantee of his presence. It was only through continued obedience that would assure that. And we see God here is fulfilling his promise given to David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 5 through 16. In the temple, it was a special place for man to meet with God. And the pagans thought that their gods lived in the temples, but the God of Israel dwelt among his people. In verse 14 through 38, we're going to read a huge chunk here. It says, "So Solomon built the temple and finished it. And he built the inside walls of the temple with cedar boards. From the floor of the temple to the sound, he paneled the inside with wood, and he covered the floor of the temple with planks of cypress. Then he built a 20-cubit room near the rear of the temple from the floor to sound with cedar boards. He built it inside as the inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. And in front of it, the temple sanctuary was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with ornamental buds and open flowers. All was cedar. There was no stone to be seen. And he prepared the inner sanctuary inside the temple to set the ark of the covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold and overlaid the altar of cedar. So Solomon overlaid the inside of the temple with pure gold. He stretched gold chains across from the front of the inner sanctuary, and overlaid it with gold. The whole temple he overlaid with gold until he had finished all the temple. Also he overlaid with gold the entire altar that was by the inner sanctuary. Inside the inner sanctuary he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each of 10 cubits high. One wing of the cherub was 5 cubits, and the other wing of the cherub 5 cubits. 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. And the other cherub was 10 cubits. Both cherubim were of the same size and shape. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was the other cherub. Then he set the cherubim inside the inner room, and they stretched out the wings of the cherubim so that the wing of one touched one wall, and the wing of the other cherub touched the other wall. And their wings touched each other in the middle of the room. Also he overlaid the cherubim with gold, and then he carved all the walls of the temple all around, both the inner and outer sanctuaries, with carved figures of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. In the floor of the temple he overlaid with gold both the inner and outer sanctuaries. For the entrance of the inner sanctuary he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and doorposts were 1/5 of the wall. The 2 doors were of olive wood, that he carved on them figures of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold, and he spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So for the door of the sanctuary he also made doorposts of olive wood, 1/4 of the wall. And the 2 doors were of cypress wood. 2 panels comprised one folding door, and 2 panels comprised the other folding door. Then he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on them, and he overlaid them with gold applied evenly on the carved work. And he built the inner court with 3 rows of hewn stone and the row of cedar beams. In the 4th year the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Jiv, and in the 11th year, in the month of Buel, which is the 8th month, the house was finished with all its details according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it. So I know that was a lot to take in. A lot of people, they just kind of go through this passage real quick because it's all about descriptions. But to break down what I just read here, the inner sanctuary partitioned off from the main hallway by cedar planks, and it was the perfect cube of approximately 30 feet on a side, and it was the most sacred area of the temple. And now the most holy place is further described through verses 19 through 28 here, as we see. And the tabernacle also had a most holy place when you look at the details of it back in Exodus 26 verse 33 through 34. And the temple sanctuary was the holy place just outside the most holy place that was approximately 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high, that housed the altar of incense, and the golden tables of the showbread, and the golden lampstands, as we'll talk a little bit more about in our next video when we continue 1 Kings next week. And remember from Exodus 25 verse 10 through 22 and Exodus 37 verse 1 through 9 that the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord was a rectangular box that was made of acacia wood. And the ark was made at Mount Sinai by Bezalel according to the pattern that was given by Moses. And remember that the ark held the 2 tablets inside it of the 10 commandments, as seen in Exodus 25 and Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 1 through 5. And the other thing to note about the ark is it also served as the place in the inner sanctuary or most holy place where the presence of the Lord met Israel back in Exodus 25. And gold was beaten into fine sheets, and then it was hammered, fit over the beautifully embellished wood, and then attached to every surface in the temple proper, both in the holy place and both in the most holy place, so that no wood or stone was visible. And cherubim, remember, they're the two-winged creatures with human faces that overlaid with gold, as seen back in very early on Genesis 3:24, and later on in Ezekiel 41 verse 18 through 19. And they stood guard on either side of the ark, as seen in 2 Chronicles account chapter 3 verse 10 through 13. And they are not to be confused with the cherubim on the mercy seat, as also seen back in Exodus 25. But they represented angelic beings who were guardians of God's presence and stood on either side of the ark in the most holy place, as we'll see in chapter 8 verse 6 through 7. And a little bit of a description is given of them here. They're about 15 feet tall, 15 feet between the wingtips of them. In the palm trees, it gives an image of the Garden of Eden back in Genesis chapter 2. In the palm tree, it represented the tree of life from the garden. And there was distinct and magnificent separation by doors between the inner court of the temple and the holy place, as well as the holy place and the most holy place. And the inner court was walled in open space that surrounded the temple, and it was called the court of the priests later on in 2 Chronicles account, 2 Chronicles chapter 4 verse 9, or the upper court in Jeremiah 36 verse 10. In the wall of the court, it had a layer of wood between each of the three courses of stone. And the alteration of timber beams with masonry was common in Mediterranean style construction. And from the foundation to finishing, we see that at the end of this chapter that the temple took 7.5 years. And you also see that later on in 2 Chronicles chapter 5 verse 1. But to wrap up, maybe if you're still around, you were probably thinking about shutting off this video if you hate math. But the things that might not be the most interesting to us in the Old Testament, there is a purpose and they do point to things. And so to wrap up, we look at the architect of the basic dimensions of the temple given. And the dimensions of the temple, it also tells us that it was built on the same basic design as the tabernacle, but it was twice as large as the tabernacle. And Solomon meant that the temple to be a continuation of the tabernacle. And we looked at the details of the construction. We see that God speaks to Solomon, and God makes a promise to Solomon that obedience was required for Solomon to reign and being blessed. And then we saw the end of the chapter describing the finishing of the temple. And what we must remember when we study through these hard passages of scripture is that under the old covenant, the temple was not for the people of Israel. It was only for the priest to go in and to meet with God on behalf of the people. And the people, they gathered and they worshiped in the outer court of the temple. And without the continued faithfulness to God, this glorious temple quickly faded and plundered just 5 years after Solomon's death, as we're going to see in about 3 weeks from now. And when you look at the temple, you might be like, well, what's all this relevant for with the temple? What is all these measurements? Why not just give us a sentence saying what the temple was for, that it was built, so on and so forth? Under the old covenant here, we needed a priest to act on our behalf. And today, Jesus is our high priest. Jesus is the temple of God. And we enter, fellowship with the Father through Jesus. And so I just want you to think, what does this give us a picture of here? Even if it doesn't seem interesting to you or maybe boring or whatever the case is. But that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next tomorrow as we're going to step out of 1 Kings for another topical message. So I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.